It's a fact that pretty much everybody nowadays that lure fishes does so with braid. Braid gives loads of positives in your fishing. You can feel more bites, you can use it as a bite indicator, it's nice and direct, it's easy to work with most of the time. So one of the things you need to get right when you lure fishing with braid is to get it on the reel correctly. Now there are a number of bad ways of doing this that will result in lots of problems with your fishing. So I'm going to run through how to load braid onto your reel properly to give you a pretty foolproof system when it comes to fishing. So the reel I'm going to use today is one of the 4,500 new Prism X's, lovely reel. Perfect for pike fishing, slightly larger than the other two, so you can fit lots of large diameter braid on there. So we'll start with that and load it up now. First thing to remember with this, and to make it easier when you're loading braid, is to use a butt section of a lure rod. The reason for that is it makes it easier to hold the reel. It also makes it easier to feed the braid and the mono you're going to use to start off with onto the reel itself. So get it nice and tight onto your butt section, open the bail arm, and then start with some mono. Now the mono you should use, you can use any mono really, but you want to keep it a low profile. What I do is try and kind of match it to the braid that I'm using. I'm using quite heavy braid on this one, it's going to be 20-pound braid, so I'm going with this 10-pound mono. So to get your mono onto your spool and give it plenty of grip so you've got a good basis for your braid going on, I start off with an overhand loop, so just like that. Now these knots at the back end on the mono don't have to be particularly strong, because if you're playing a fish that gets you down to this, you're in big enough trouble as it is. You've got the wrong tackle or you've got a very big fish on. So what I do then, I have the overhand loop and then I pass the length of the mono through that loop, and to give you a lasso essentially. What we want that to do is tighten as the bail arm opens, just tighten round, and that'll give you good grip on the spool. So you'll know which way your bail arm goes round. What you want is for the line to run so that when that bail arm moves round, it tightens up the noose. So just slip it over the top of the spool, and you'll see, look, that's not slipping anywhere. If you did that with braid, that'd slip all over the place. But that tightens up on itself and grips. It's particularly good with a spool like on the Prism X's, where they have these little grooves for the line to get into and grip really tightly. So once that's on, keep it tight, close the bail arm up, keep the mono tight with your fingers, and then just wind. Let's move the mono down here. Wind on enough mono to just cover most of the spool. Just give you lots of grip. So that should be about enough there. Just so that there's plenty of mono to cover the spool, so that when you get lots of pressure on the line from a fish or a snag or whatever, the braid doesn't slip. From there, you've got to attach your mono to your braid, and that involves another knot. Where have I put my snips? Right. So snip off your mono. You're done with that for now. Take your spool of braid. And what you're going to tie is a uni to uni knot. That's what I use. Essentially, you just want to use a knot that's low profile. The reason I like the uni to uni knot is because it's essentially two knots along the line which butt up together. So instead of having all the mono and all the braid all bunched up in one, if you did like a granny knot, it'll all be bunched up in one big lump of line. This spreads it out. And the reason you want it spread out is because when you get the braid laying over the top of that, you don't want a big lump sticking up. That can affect your casting and just looks horrible as well. So uni to uni knot. What you want to start with is the lines running together like that, parallel with each other. Myself a bit more braid off. And what you're going to do is loop the mono alongside the braid and then pass the mono underneath itself and the braid to trap the braid 5 times. So it's 3, 5. Moisten it so you don't loosen, you don't weaken the mono or the braid. That's what the moisture's for, stop the heat build up. Then do exactly the same the other side with the braid and the mono. So have the braid going back underneath itself, trapping the mono. Again, 5 times is fine because you don't need a real strong knot on this. You're going to have enough braid on here so you don't need to go down to essentially what is the backing of the mono. Moisten it again, tighten it up, and now what you're after, you're going to pull the two together so they butt up against each other. So with those two done, just gently pull them together. They'll butt up against each other. With the mono end, you might need to tighten that up a little bit. There we go. A nice low profile knot. It's not going to affect how your line lays on top of this. Cut off the tag ends as close as you can, just so there's nothing for the braid to catch on. Okay, so there we go. Your mono is attached to your braid. All that's left now to do is wind it onto your reel. Now, the way that your reel spins when you've got the anti-reverse on is the same way as the braid will come off of the top of the spool that it's loaded onto. So essentially what you need to do is make sure the braid comes off the top of the spool. You don't want it from the back, you just want it from the top of the spool. So what I would do, lay that on the floor and have it directly underneath the butt ring so that it just comes straight up and then straight onto the reel. So pop that on the floor, directly underneath your butt ring so that it doesn't catch on the lip of the spool when it comes off the braid and sends it flying all over the place. Still with your fingers, keeping it nice and tight. Now the braid will cut into your fingers if you hold it too tight and go too fast, and you'll get little burns. So just be sensible and feel it. But you want it tight enough so that it's not baggy. The worst thing you can do is put this braid on so it's a little bit loose, because what will happen then is when you get some pressure on it when it's all loaded, so if you hook into a fish or you hook into a snag and pull on it, it will bed down into itself, and then the next time you cast it won't come off the spool and you'll have all sorts of problems. You'll have to take all the braid off and restart. So keeping it nice and tight with your fingers, load it on to the spool. Now it's important to keep an eye on how much braid you put onto your spool. Mainly you don't want to overfill it. If you overfill it, when you cast, what will happen is the braid that's coming off the reel will catch on the braid that's sitting too close to the spool, pull it off, and you'll get wind knots. That's what happens. It will catch up, it will all come off, spin up together, and cause you all sorts of problems. Equally, you don't want it too underfilled, because the braid as it comes off the spool will hit the lip of the spool, and that'll take a lot of your casting energy, and you won't get as decent a cast as you want to. So you want it somewhere in the middle, somewhere between, depending on your spool, depending on your braid, somewhere about 3, 4, 5 mil from the lip. So keep going until you get to that distance from the lip of the spool. That's looking quite good. I'm saying we're pretty much there. And that's it. I'm nicely loaded, ready to go. Loaded spool. The way to check that you haven't got too baggy a lay on there is to use your nail, and if you can get your nail down quite far into the braid, it's on too baggy. To make sure, when you first go out with your newly loaded reel, to make sure that it's not too baggy, and it's on there nicely. Get a heavy lure for your setup. So if you're on a 1000 reel, you'd go for a lighter one than you would with a 4.5, but you know, a heavy lure for the setup. Cast it out 4 or 5 times as far as you can, so you're at the extremes of your casting range, because you know normally you wouldn't go that far, so you'd make sure you've got enough braid on there that's been cast out, and then with the resistance of that lure, bring it back, so to keep the tension on the braid, get a bit of water on there which help it bed in even further. Do that 4 or 5 times and you should be good to go. It's as simple as that. So that's how you load up a spool properly. Make sure you do this, make sure you don't just put braid onto the spool directly. That's one of the main things to learn from this. Make sure you don't overfill or underfill your spool. Get going, that's it.